for my picture to appear on TV and it just won't. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristen Stevens, and we're here, Commissioner from District 2. We're here this afternoon for a work session. Our discussion item this afternoon is Judicial Needs Study. I'm here with my colleagues, Commissioner John Kafalis from District 1, Commissioner Jody Shattuck McNally from District 3. We also have our Lorinda Volker, our county manager, with us today. I believe Ken Cooper from Facilities will be presenting, probably with the assistance of our consultants, and we have a whole host of dignitaries in the room, so but just wanted to point out that Chief Judge Blanco is here and Sheriff Justin Smith is here and other folks, and if you come up, please feel free to introduce yourselves. So welcome everyone, and we will get started.
Thank you, Commissioners. Ken Cooper, Director of Facilities, here with Jeff Lane and Tim Dibble. They are the consultants from Trainer HL and also the Justice Management Institute. You mentioned Judge Blanco. Kristen Browning is also with us from the judicial folks, and from the State Court Administrator's Office, we have Elizabeth Romanowski and John Gossett. The DA office is also represented. Mary is here. And let's see, Josh from Budget. We've got, let's see, and Kristen behind me here. So thank you all for your time today. 1 year ago, we had met and went through information regarding kind of the big saddle that the county still faces in terms of the ability to meet the needs for judicial, for 8th Judicial District, for the space that it requires now and into roughly a 20-year window. It really, I think it's worth noting, we've got a very good relationship, many years of good collaborative work, working with judicial as we've kind of filled out that building. And unfortunately, the last project that we did over there to build one more courtroom is a smaller version. They were very flexible with that project, and it cost the county about $1 million. It allowed us to get one more courtroom built. We're kind of at the end of that rope without displacing potentially somebody. You'll recall that a couple of years ago we ended up having to displace the probation staff over to Prospect Parkway. So that that creates some inefficiencies, although I think that's been a good relationship and a good situation for them overall, but obviously not ideal. The model, and we've talked about this a little bit in previous meetings, but the model that the state and the counties have is a pretty tough model. When one organization is responsible for providing space for another, it really naturally is very challenging. And we're here today to talk through some of those challenges, but certainly opportunities. And when we met a year ago, the goal that we had, or one of the goals that we had for putting this project together, was to try to build as best we could a study that would allow for things to start to begin to funnel down a little bit. You start with many options, and you try to start to pare down, see what might fit. I think what you end up with is something that isn't ideal for any of the two, between the county and the state. Maybe not ideal for either, but something that might be manageable. And so when we began this process, we did our best to fit into that as kind of an umbrella, that being a goal. Unfortunately, the numbers that you'll see today, it's a very big challenge for the county, and certainly for judicial as well, to look at what it's going to mean, how quickly we can turn it around, what the disruptions are going to be, things like that. So any of those things, I'm not trying to be too much of a wet blanket, but certainly when we're talking about a project of this scale, or whatever, wherever we land on, it's going to be a significant undertaking for the two groups as we move forward. So I think with that, Jeff is going to take us through and talk specifically about the slides and how they relate back to the actual study itself, and certainly ask questions along the way if you'd like, but we'll have time for as we roll up as well. So thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone.
Excellent, thank you. Jeff Lane. So part of what I want to echo is, as Ken said, feel free to ask questions as we move through the presentation. It goes a lot better in that fashion sometimes than waiting till the tail end. So we will pause a tad bit between each slide. So if there are some questions, be more than happy to answer or work through whatever we did or what that question might be. So thank you again for allowing us to come today and kind of present where we are. So we started this process as a team, and most everyone in this room's been a part of the process of working through what are some of the next steps, what's that program look like, what are the needs for the 8th Judicial District. So we've gone through that, and the initial goal that we set out was to seek a judicial space needs study for the county and the 8th Judicial District. And then when we worked through that process, we set that out early on and said, here's what that is. It's a big blanket, right, at the end of the day. So we had some objectives, and you have those in front of you. I'm not going to read them all because you've probably read them. I will say that we've really tried hard as a group and as a team collaboratively to make sure that this report comes back and hits these objectives. And I think that the framework, the foundation has been set to move the needle forward on whichever option you choose based on these objectives. I do want to say that we did evaluate a multitude of options, although there are 10 that are shown up in the booklet in some way, shape, or form. There were probably 15 or 20 that we looked at. We looked at options that not just in the downtown community area, but we looked at options that were outside of this downtown area, but keeping it within the county, within Fort Collins and the county seat. So we did those things because I think it's important whenever you're looking at a study like this to evaluate all of those elements. And we can share that data at a future date if we need to, but we kind of toned down most of what we were trying to do in a very small snippet today. I would also like to say that we have completed a draft of our report, and we'll spend the next few weeks wrapping up and tying up some of the loose ends that we have on that end for us and making sure everybody's had an opportunity to review it and provide comments back, and then we'll be able to actually publish that and put that out to the entire group. So you'll get a full version with an executive summary and what have you.
My name is Tim Dibble. I'm from the Justice Management Institute. We're located in Arlington, Virginia, but we've been working with Trainer HL and Jeff specifically over for a number of projects. So thank you for having us and for giving us this time to present. The project has a lot of detail. When you get the report, you're going to see that there's enormous amount of detail in there about the way in which we modeled the different scenarios and how we looked at it. But the foundation for it was a significant amount of time we spent at the beginning really looking at the space needs of the 8th Judicial District. And we put the state court administrator up here because the way that the district courts in Colorado work is that there's an equitable distribution of judges for each of the counties based on workload, caseload, and other criteria they use. So that evaluation is done by the State Court Administrator's Office, and we have some representatives here with us about that. And they also provided us with a 20-year space needs projection based on what is the fundamental unit of measure, which is the number of judges needed in a courthouse. It's the biggest driver of space. It's the biggest driver of staff. It is also one of the fundamental units of measure for instance, the district attorney's office in terms of how they staff their office with attorneys and with the staff that support them. So those needs are really defined based on what the state court administrator's office, and it's not just judges, but they also look at staff, and they look at staff based on both for judicial administration and for the clerk of courts. And they also look at probation. So we looked at probation needs also driven by caseload in the county. And then the space standards themselves, they provide a lot of space standard criteria and guidelines for the district court. We used as a foundation for that, the space that's in the existing building, but then adjusted based on the standards that are provided, especially for any new expansion space. So 20 years of projections imply that there will be an expansion of needs in the courthouse. So as an example, your basic fundamental unit of measure would be a courtroom, a jury trial courtroom. The state standard is 1,850 square feet. So, you know, that represents about a 30 by 60 or some permutation of that 30 feet by 60 foot room. And then a magistrate's hearing room, as an example, would be 1,200 square feet. Any questions about that?
Questions, commissioners? Commissioner Kafalis.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, colleagues. Tim, will you be getting into more of the criteria that the state administrator uses to determine judicial needs other than population growth, caseload? I mean, are there other factors that they consider, and will you be getting into those later on?
We didn't directly address the factors that were used to make the projections. And again, John and Elizabeth can speak to this more than we can, but they do what they call a balanced workload assessment every periodic few years or so that they run across the whole state to look at what the needs are. And one of the more interesting outcomes of that, and they're going to be doing another one, I believe they're in the middle of doing one now, is that the workload needs have shifted because there are a lot more services provided with problem-solving courts, with the kinds of services provided in family courts, as an example. In family, they don't have a family division, but family needs, and those services and those kinds of workload needs have really grown over the years. So there's a lot of study that goes into both judicial and judicial officer and staff needs for those kinds of functions too.
May I do a quick follow-up?
Yes, you may.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. And I seem to recall the last time we talked about this, there was also discussion about the appropriate use of technology and, where it makes sense of allowing for digital interactions. I presume that the folks take that into consideration as well. Yes,
it's not a really central issue that's covered in this report because we really are looking at a judicial space needs study. We certainly spent a lot of time. We met with the IT folks from the state because they do most of the technology in the courthouse for the district and county courts. And that was really important because we were able to document a lot of what they would call the baseline needs and standards. From a design perspective, that is an annex or an addendum to the report. It's not the central feature of the report, but that documentation has been very important.
Thank you. I think we're good.
So when we started this process in January, we really spent a lot of time first interviewing every group that was a part of the space program. So we went through that. Initially, we had some great discussions with each of the groups in each of the departments and the elected officials. And we spent time thinking through both what the SCAO had provided as well as then looking at best practices. And you can see here on the chart what we really looked at across the board from a functional needs standpoint, a staffing needs, and projecting that out as it went through for the space program. And then our process from that space program was to look at alternatives. And as I stated earlier, we spent a considerable amount of time looking at whether it was located here, located somewhere else, annex additions, expansions, those types of things across the board, and thinking about what that was and then what those costs may be. So the report really starts to tie back to those elements and provide some thoughts as it relates to that, and starting points and discussion points for both the county and the judicial district to have as it relates to those areas.
Any questions about that?
Questions? I don't think so. We're good.
So one of the more important issues, and this is really, again, a way of building a an analysis of the space program. In other words, what are the specific detailed space needs, and how does that expand to become a whole building program that they can be used for the design phase in the future. And we organize it by these particular functions or agencies or courts or departments in the building. It's 1 through 9. And these are the ones that exist in the Justice Center. Number 10 is obviously not in the building. We modeled some scenarios at the request of the 8th Judicial District Court to look at possibly consolidating probation back into the building for a variety of reasons, including issues around security, and because they were originally in the building. So we modeled some of those scenarios, and you'll see those today. But all of the other ones are functions that are in the Justice Center. We also looked at some of the functions that were in the Loveland Police and Courts building, and even though that's not in this building, there's 2 courtroom sets down there and some other functions for the district attorney and probation office. So this is important because this kind of analysis means that when we get to the design phase, there will be some adjustments made, but the adjustments would be very easy to make. So if the staffing counts were off by 1 or 2 or 3 people, just because there were positions that weren't filled, or they look and see that the projections have slightly changed after a year, that will be able to be done very easily using a very detailed space program, which you'll see in the report when you get it. So these are the 10 scenarios. And the 3 fundamental scenarios that we put in the report and were the ones that we eventually looked at in detail. The number 1 was an all-new Justice Center. And this has some advantages, the cost being the least of the advantages. The second one is building an annex or a set of annexes to the existing Justice Center. And the third one is essentially a combination of the first 2. But it is, the reason why we separated it out is because we proposed this idea of a family services center as what would be the annex would be described as such. There would be other needs, including the expansion of the district attorney's office and possibly expansion of prisoner holding and also court parking in the basement that may not necessarily have to be part of the annex. So 3 is the idea of how do you model something which is a family services center, because what you're really doing is identifying specific spaces that belong to that type of function and saying those are the spaces that would be in scenario 3. And this has a lot of detail on it. You can see here that for each of these different alternatives, we looked at what that amount of space would represent so we could cost it. And so as an example, in 1A, it was a whole new Justice Center that also included bringing the 2 Loveland County courtrooms into the building and consolidating it. And so we had to look at what that represented in terms of area because that impacted cost. And we're not going to go into any detail on any of this, and I'm going to give you a summary slide here in a minute. But the most important number is that second number, the second column of numbers, which says new area, gross square feet. So that's the expansion that would be necessary under these scenarios. That would represent the size of either an annex or a combination of expansions to the existing Justice Center. Of course, the 158,290 you see in the first column doesn't appear in the scenario 1 because an all-new replacement Justice Center would not have a reuse of the existing courthouse. And so one of the things was very important to do is model what would it cost to locate folks that are in the existing Justice Center and move them to another location, or to remodel the Justice Center to deal with things like ADA accessibility issues, which are most pronounced in the courtrooms, but also remodeling some of the spaces like the district attorney's office and judicial administration and other spaces. So we won't dwell on this. It's complex. It was a lot of models, but the basic 3 are the all new, the expansion, and the standalone family services or annex as a family services center.
So one of the things I want to touch on real quick so we get the terminology correct, because I am concerned. Not that I'm really that concerned, but I am a tad bit concerned. So when we talk about an annex, we actually are talking about an expansion to the existing facility. And I want to make that clear because a lot of times when you hear about annex, you think of a separate building somewhere else. There is a scenario in here that talks about a standalone family services center, okay? And you could consider that as an annex if you so chose, but it does say standalone. So I just want to clarify that so that when Tim uses the word annex, recognize we're really talking about an expansion to the existing building.
And we will, without dwelling on it any longer, but to highlight one reason why a replacement facility has an appeal from one perspective, and that is that from a construction and relocation perspective, you build a new building, everybody moves into it, and then you figure out what to do with the existing building. And that from a churn and how you manage a courthouse while it's also in fully operational is the biggest advantage of a separate new building, is it makes it much easier to make that transition. This is a summary of that same slide. And the two important numbers are reuse area and new construction. And here is where the A, B, and C really come into play and are very much highlighted, because A and B are the 8th Judicial District and the feedback we got from them, and Chief Judge Blanco is here now and can talk to this more than we can, but the idea that there would be a consolidated county courthouse with the county courts in one location, the county seat, and that which is A, and B is you do that as well as you combine probation into the existing courthouse, and so your new construction starts to grow even by that amount. And then the C is modeling what you do, and you balance that out by having the district attorney relocated to somewhere else within, hopefully, walking distance of the existing Justice Center. So that is what C and both the 2 and the number 1 scenarios are. You've now consolidated all of the functions of the county of the 8th Judicial District into one courthouse, and you off balance that by saving some costs in terms of new construction by relocating the district attorney to office space or other space nearby. So that's the C model. Any questions about those?
Commissioner Cavallis has a question.
Thank you. Just to clarify, probably just for my sake, in this chart space allocation table, when you say total new for example, option 2 annex or expanding the facility, does that 113 represent total, or is that on top of the 158?
On top of the 158.
So an expansion would look like the sum of those two gross square feet. Is that right, sir?
You add them together, yes. That would be the existing courthouse plus the expansion would be 71,000 square feet, yes.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
And the 113,357 really represents a number that is driven by the projected needs of the judiciary for the next 20 years. So, and those numbers are really driven by the growth of Larimer County and the expected caseload growth. That is the factor driving the need for what would be an additional 14 judges across the county and district courts, or judicial officers. And we can go into more detail about that if you wish, but that's really what it represents.
What if it was not probably not going to get built next year, or I don't know. I mean, we haven't really talked about timeframes. So do we need to go further than 20 years out to? I mean, have you modeled scenarios where you go a little further out to see if it were delayed 5 to 10 years, what kind of needs we would need at that point?
So we did not. We didn't look at that. And one of the reasons behind that is so that the data that we have currently gets us to 20, right? And I can share with you, doing this over a long period of time in my career, 20 is actually really, really hard to get to. And to go beyond 20 is a guess. And it becomes more difficult to provide good data and good information on what that looks like. We could evaluate that and we could provide some information to what that may be, but that data may not be anywhere near where you're going to be in that 30-year period. You'll be able to notice a lot more of that in the next 10 years. I think from what I know and what I've seen over the years from a projection perspective, it's just like cost. I tell people when we talk about cost, you can do cost for the next year, maybe 2 years. Once you get beyond that, it's a crystal ball, and your guess is as good as mine. And I think with space programs, what we found over the years is once you get beyond 20, it really is a crystal ball item. And that would be unfair, I think, to the 8th Judicial District and to the county to try to project what that looks like.
No, fair enough. Is it something that if we were, I mean, then clearly we could reevaluate, and if it happened in 5 years, and I don't want anybody to panic in the room of like, we've decided this, but, that we would reevaluate those needs for 20 years out at that point too.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great way to achieve that, is to, when you're ready and when that looks like, is to then start to think about, okay, do we need to reevaluate, and what does that look like over the next 20 years from that starting point?
Sure. I guess my fear is sort of, did we, as we have a building that we built and it's not adequate for our needs right now, and maybe that was predicted when the building was built, but it's nice to not have to, these buildings are expensive, and I don't know what use of the, if we contemplate building an all-new Justice Center, I'm not sure what that would become, or the desire for a space that was like that would be in Old Town. And so, thinking about, and I'm sure that we can talk about this later, but just sort of future use for a building and the ability to sort of add on to it. Some of these, I feel like having more foresight might help us 20 years down the road not to be in the same place we're at, which feels pretty uncomfortable in that this is very expensive. We need a ton of square feet. We don't know what we do with an old building. We don't know if we have the money for a new building. And so I guess maybe to try to avoid some of that, that's why I asked those questions.
Yeah, I guess the upside of that, Commissioner, is that once we do, once the county is able to move forward with the project, you would go back immediately and basically reconfirm all those spaces. So it wouldn't be a loss of data. You would, if that's 3 years out or 2 years, right? You put a stake in the ground at that point, and that's when you really begin the project. This is, these are scenarios that are based on, just kind of generalities of meeting the space needs. Once you got to that point, once the county would be able to have a strategy to get there financially, you really, an awful lot of the information, and it's been really an excellent process. The judicial folks and the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office, others have all really given an awful lot of time and effort into this thing. So there's a good amount of information that's collected, but it would be primarily a foundation for what would happen if and when the county were to move forward with a capital project, whether that meant an expansion, which is a consideration, or whether it meant a new building, or a separate, smaller building to support, the existing. Those are things that we'll talk about a little bit more. But you really would have, it'd be a very good foundational piece, but an awful lot changes even in a year. Business plans change, and staffing, numbers change, and there's all kinds of things, that could, really impact the equations that we're talking about today. So.
And I think sometimes it's valuable, and to kind of look at people who are sort of futurists, and I don't know, to see what we think that the future courts might look like. I don't. It just seems like trying to future-proof, I guess, and have a building that doesn't feel like it's obsolete in a certain amount of time, and how do you protect from that?
Yeah, Jeff mentioned, the difficulty with getting past 20 years, even in a 5-year window, it's generally pretty decent. But once you get past that, for instance, in a facilities master plan, it really does become something where you're primarily projecting, a growth trend, and then you continue that. Unfortunately, on the cost side, you've heard me, I'm a broken record, right, on that. That is not a trend line that we, pick a point. That's the most unpredictable figure. None of us, nobody in this industry would have would have ever given thought to where we are today compared to where we were 4 years ago. There is just, it would never have happened. And so that's dark, but that's the reality of it. And we all are in that, but hopefully that helps at least in
Yeah,
terms
sure.
of what it could look like going forward.
Right.
The information isn't lost. You could project and do your darndest. The county really did a pretty remarkable job building what was expected to be roughly a 20-year solution. Roughly 20 years later, here we are. And so you make a very good point in terms of let's try to figure it out so we're, give ourselves a little more room. But we are, obviously playing some catch up. So thank you.
Thank you.
The space program is very detailed. And we fully expect that when you enter a design phase, that there will be a final reality check and adjustments made. It really won't have any dramatic effect on the bottom line if it's done in the next year or two. If it's done in 5 years, there might have to be another discussion with the State Court Administrator's Office and making sure that the numbers align with what they see as the needs in Larimer County for the district court and the county courts.
Thank you.
So in addition to the space program, and we're done with those numbers for the moment, but we use them as really the basis for looking at the 10 scenarios. And one of the evaluation, that we did an evaluation in the report, which we're going to show you here in a minute, of the 10 scenarios, and we use 9 criteria to evaluate it. And these are both qualitative and quantitative. We used a scoring of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best for each of these and 1 being the lowest. And you discovered that there's no perfect scenario, as Ken said earlier. And it has to do with the fact that the variables that count for some things work really well for instance, the cost factors or the build factors. We're not going to go through all of these, but things like build and cost, and things like visibility are really very much county variables, and thinking about sort of the public perception of the courthouse. We felt that those variables were very important. The cost is clearly a very large factor, and it's probably one of the biggest drivers from the county's perspective. At this point, this is a Trainer HL JMI evaluation, although we use feedback that we receive from all of the stakeholders, but it's still our subjective evaluation. It was interesting to see where it came out. We had one in there for the district attorney access to the building, and so that had some impact on the C options. And so public access, we felt, was important to kind of really throw that in there as an evaluation of where the courthouse is in Fort Collins in terms of being in either Old Town or centrally located. From an architect's perspective, the county seat, the central location is Old Town, but that's not necessarily the population or center of gravity for the county. And then we also have the access to the public in Loveland, which is sort of the value of really why some of the county courts are down in Loveland. So these are the variables we used. You can go through, whoops, I don't know what I'm doing here. You can go through and look at these. Oh, you already moved there. And look at them yourselves. We think it's very important for the county to look at this, and for the 8th Judicial District and even the other stakeholders in the courthouse, the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office, and really think through what these criteria and what the evaluation would be. But what we did was use our subjective evaluation of this, and we scored them. And then we came out with, because cost is a big factor, so you get a very large differential in cost, but that's not the only one. For instance, the C options become, get low scores, because that's a 1 to 5 scoring on district attorney access. And then some of the other ones around feasibility, operations, build. As an example, number 1, in terms of ease of operations and ease of build, gets very, very high scores, because that makes those 2 variables very easy to handle. And so you can see here that option 2 and option 3A, which is the Family Services Center as an annex, as an expansion to the existing courthouse, are the highest scoring.
And to that, I will say this is somewhat There's some logic to what we did here based on what we know and how we do certain pieces. But to Tim's point, I think I want to circle up one thing that I think is really important about this as you look at this in the report. I think the county and the 8th Judicial District and others need to take this and evaluate it from their perspective as well, because I think you will find that there are some that would show up maybe a tad bit different, 1 or 2 points one way or the other, right? And I think that allows for that conversation to be had. But I do think this is a starting point to at least start the dialogue and start having a conversation about what makes the most sense, and based on the work that we've done here over the last 4 to 6 months. Thoughts, questions?
Anything, commissioners? Just looking.
You'll see in the report that we actually rank them in a bar chart, and so it's very easy to see which ones are the highest ranking.
So one of the things that I want to do before we go down the next road of actually showing some diagrams that we pulled together, both from a block and stack diagram component as well as looking at where they might fit within the site that's currently here or a different location. But I want to talk about cost, because you're going to see cost on each one of these scenarios as we move forward, right? One of the things I want to share is just, and again, I'm not going to read these because you have them in front of you, but I do want to share that we did not evaluate some things within that cost, whether that was land acquisition, because that's a tough nut to crack to understand what that is. I mean, we could put in what the value is, but there's a lot of pieces and parts that move in that scenario. We were not charged as a team to look at Loveland from the standpoint of what those needs may be or not be, and what that may cost. So that was not part of our evaluation here as well. And then, so I think those are the two big ones that I would share. I do want to share about the other one. So the non-secure parking for public, we don't have anything currently in that scenario or anything in our scenarios for that, as that I think is a discussion that you may have as you decide which option you choose.
As a quick follow-up to that, the work that happened with the facilities master plan, and then what led up to what got plugged into the ballot measure in 2018 that was not successful. 2019. It assumed at that time roughly 13 million for some kind of a structure that would be a shared piece. That also makes that a little tougher, to dive into that as a shared piece with the city of Fort Collins, anticipating that, and with the DDA. So anyway, it gives you at least a teeny sense of what the county has considered previously to this, and obviously those are old numbers and all that, but it's significant.
So we will. Yeah.
Commissioner Kafalios, please. You're welcome.
On the previous slide, cost clarifications, what's not included. The first bullet, land acquisition for all but westerly expansion of current Justice Center. So does that mean that the consideration for land acquisition and expansion would be the L shape that we've talked about in the past?
It does, yeah. Certainly for the pieces that we're talking about as a standalone facility, the expansion that could happen is westerly, right? That's the property the county owns into that park area. What we can't do without an acquisition is to go south, which is the ideal, or at least was considered to be the ideal location for all the groups that were involved when the facilities master plan occurred. So in the work that happened in 2017 and 2018, it was looked at as a ideal location for the county to expand that building, come in this direction to the south. We would have to acquire that property, and we do have and have had information, basically an agreement, bouncing between the county and the city, and it's currently in the city of Fort Collins, and may include an arrangement with property the county has. So
If I may, just because I know at least I've expressed some concern about taking out Civic Center Park, and I think that concern has been registered. So thank you for acknowledging that. And on the final bullet, land acquisition for new justice center, and I know it relates to what we might be able to work out with the city. But in terms of new construction, could that occur on Vine Drive on the 7.5 acres?
We're not anticipating that would be a fit for this project.
Why not?
Well,
Just curious. You're
there's
the facilities guy. I'm just a county commissioner.
yeah, I think the overall expectations for just the size and for a future, to Commissioner Stevens' point, in terms of a natural growth pattern like that, I think, it's a relatively small site. It's a relatively small buildable site, and so it's got sort of inhibitions that make that tougher. So we haven't looked very deeply into that, but that's been kind of our assumption.
So it's all good. I think we can all agree we have to be as creative and smart about this as possible, and as much as possible think outside the box.
Sure.
You're welcome.
So in scenario one, Ken, if you want to, thanks. So in scenario one, so these all match up with the charts that you've already seen, and then you'll see in the booklet. So we wanted to try to make sure that we were as clear as possible on what we were talking about. So this is a true all-new Justice Center. Now, I will tell you what I consider this, the stage in which we were in this component from a stacking diagram and a blocking diagram is really a test fit. And it's still to see if what we have from a square footage perspective can work within the site and or the area that we have. So that's really what we looked at as it relates to this. And so you can see here, this is a standalone new 7-story courthouse. It still would allow for the ability to keep the central courtyard space that's there. The existing building would then have the opportunity to be something for the county further, could be sold, whatever that needed to be at that location. Next slide. So in the stacking diagram and then the blocking diagram, we started to actually look at how departments and how pieces actually start to fit within that new facility. So you can see here what we started to look at from level 0, which I would consider the lower level, from secure parking to holding to staff secure parking as well. And then level 1 with those departments that need to be on level 1, and then looking at level 2, very similar, and then stacking courtrooms above that all the way up to 7 stories. This does meet the projected needs for the 2040 program that's been put together. I will tell you that this is the ballpark cost. So what we did here is we gave a range. And what I like to do in these scenarios is think about a range from low to high, because we really are looking at cost from the perspective of cost per square foot. And you may call somebody and tell you it's X, and you may call somebody else and tell you it's Y, right? And we don't know a lot of what's happening. I mean, we know what we're anticipating, the expectations that would be had in a courthouse. So I do feel comfortable with the range, okay? But on the same hand, we haven't had a conversation with all the users to talk about quality, to talk about, are we putting wood in every courtroom? Are we providing terrazzo in all the public areas? Okay, so we haven't had that conversation as it relates to what this building has and doesn't have. Are we a brick building? Are we a metal panel building? We haven't had that conversation, right? And all of those drive the cost of a project, and you guys are well aware of that. So that's the reason for the range. The other piece that I would share for you that's consistent for any of these scenarios is we also provided contingencies and project costs as a range. And then these scenarios, if we actually looked at renovation of the existing building, or if we looked at renovation of courtrooms, those are part of the cost as well, okay? So I want to be clear on that.
Can I ask a question? Does that would be seven stories? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
What is the current?
Current is
5? Okay. Does that would limit where we could build in the city because of height restrictions? Would that kind of limit us to certain corridors?
Thank you. Yeah, we've had conversations with the city about that, and they know that, that ideally we wouldn't make that kind of a change. That was part of what drove us, at the time, thinking that it would not, it wasn't the main driver, but it was an advantage to also coming south. And so anyway, yeah. But this would play into that in terms of what Rebecca Everett and other staff there are aware of, and it seemed to us in the conversations, it's been a while ago that we had those conversations, we would figure out a way to work through that, so.
Okay. I do think, I mean, it would probably restrict us somewhat, though. Would you say that's fair to
Probably.
say that there's certain corridors or certain areas of the city that we wouldn't be able to put a 7-story building?
Yes, yeah, you mean a site, yeah, yes, thank you.
And the other piece to this, so if you were to look at a new Justice Center not being here centrally located in Old Town, right? And you go somewhere else, the idea there may be to look at that site and can you actually expand the building in a length or a width perspective, right? That may then say, maybe I'm not 7 stories, maybe I'm 5 stories. What's driving a lot of what we talk about as courtrooms, right, is a para-courtroom. So one of the initial images we had on the objectives was a para-courtrooms. And it's really important to look at those in that perspective. So as you think about what that layout looks like, you want to keep them in a pair of 2, okay? That way you can have the court holding piece and the elevator and those types of things all in that central core that then serves both courtrooms. So if you do a single, right, then the cost effectiveness and efficiency of that goes away. So that's one reason why we like to keep it in that fashion. So this scenario looks at it that way. And so you could then, if you had a different site, would allow you to go more lengthwise because you can add another set of para courtrooms, then you could do that. And that may reduce the height of the building at that point. Does that help?
Yeah, that's fine. It's just something to think about. Okay.
So then on scenario 2, this is the one that looks at a complete expansion to the west. So this keeps everything on the county's property. I will tell you in our study of this one as a test fit, we looked at the existing site and existing utilities. And so where we've got this identified to stop within that west expansion is really where it needs to stop. There's some major utilities that run right along that section, as well as then right into the street there as well. So for us, it was looking at the test fit and making sure that we weren't going to spend dollars to relocate utilities, and we were going to keep there. But again, if you wanted to think about that and go, what's that cost offset, right? You could think about relocating and thinking about utilities differently, and maybe that building then can expand a little further to the west. This also gets you to a 7-story scenario as well, and I can tell you based on the conversations that we've had as a team, we recognize the city would not like this one. So I share that up front. There was a conversation, and Ken and our team had it, that the city really likes the idea of being able to see the plaza space, the green space, and over the top of their own building. So recognize that was part of, I think, some of what we evaluated within our scenario evaluation. You want to go to the next one?
They were concerned too about the shadows from a tall building on the city building across the street.
Right. So on the blocking component here, you can see how we lay this out. There is an expansion and a reconfiguration of the secure holding area on the lower level. One of the things that we talked about with different departments was how do we actually improve the movement of those inmates coming to court. So there's a discussion there and an evaluation to look at in that lower level, the existing building, as well as expanding beyond that, as well as staff parking under that area as well. This one still does the same. It meets that 2040 need. And then the cost on this, because we are reusing the existing courts building as a courts building, there's a renovation component that occurs within that facility, as well as some upgrades and renovations to the existing courtrooms, but then there's just a true expansion beyond that. Scenario 3 shows a standalone family services center. This one would need to evaluate some land purchase. We also looked at the idea of actually having secure parking for staff in some fashion, because we now see that we have 2 separate buildings. How do we do that? What's that look like? We haven't made any of those design decisions, but there is the ability to capture all of that land and create some secure parking for staff. This would be a true standalone family services center with a 4-story building. It would allow for construction to occur and then movement of staff into that facility. Next one, Ken. Thank you. So you can see here again, from the standpoint of overall layout, the main floor becomes a lobby space, some court administration, jury assembly, courtroom spaces, and then stacking courtrooms above that from that perspective. Yeah. So then in scenario 3A, this is the evaluation that Tim talked about as well in the scenario package, and the idea of having an expansion to the existing building that still serves as a family services center. So the idea here is to actually have those services as part of that expansion, right? So that's where those pieces go and land at the end of the day. This would require the county to look at purchasing that land to the south. You can make the determination of whether you want all that L-shaped or whether you would just want the one area at that point. Next slide. So on this one, this does have some ability to look at some phasing as well. As you can see, we've looked at expansion to the west and the south in the block diagrams here. So this does give you that ability to think about phasing for potentially family services first, move those individuals in, do the renovation of the existing facility, get that taken care of, and then expand to the west to take care of the rest. So it allows for some ability here to think about it from that perspective. It also can be a one-shot project. This is one of those where you could also evaluate the idea of temporary space. And there's probably some folks behind me that may not like what I may say, but this project has so many different variables to it and evaluations to it that theoretically, from a cost perspective, from a project perspective, thinking about this from, can I take courts and temporarily place them somewhere for a year and I do this project, right? There's some ability to seriously think about those things that may actually save on costs from the county's perspective, from a construction perspective. It's not ideal from an operations perspective, but it also provides, when those folks are out, court's happening, this is going to be messy, this is going to have noise, this is going to have a lot of things. We didn't evaluate those things. These are things we've talked about here over the last few months, but that is something that as you think about this option, there's a vast array of ways to think about this from that perspective.
I think it's worth mentioning too that even though these are drawings and they show, 2D, to the best of our ability in terms of showing what the square footage needs would be and so on for stacking, there's been no real design work that's happened. So again, once you kick into a project, I wouldn't want this to be confused with what would actually get designed into it. So I hope that helps, at least in terms of what this study included and didn't include. So,
Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
May I ask some questions? Okay, cool. My first clarifying question is on this slide. My eyes are, I think, fading today quickly. The gray or the brownish gray, it says in this lower left-hand corner, it says Sallyport.
Yes.
Okay.
I had to focus in too.
Okay, so, well, okay, that helps a lot. My second question is, I see on page 11, I know this is my beating drum, but I still have to do it, that there are two things about the ADA needs at the level of police and courts and the security concerns at police and courts, but I see on all three scenarios that there are no renovations at the 11 police and courts building on all three scenarios. So my question is, not considered in any of these scenarios, so when, is that just a much further need or to be addressed, or where?
Yeah.
If it's on page 11 but not addressed in any of these, I'm trying to understand the disconnect.
Yeah, there are concerns that exist with that building, and obviously that's a shared facility with the city of Loveland, and so there would be a separate project, I guess, the best way to put it, that would be required, and we didn't dive into that and didn't cost any of those pieces into it as well.
Okay.
It would be a whole new kind of an open book in terms of what needed to happen there. So.
Okay, and so that would be something that we probably need to all address with the city of Loveland because of the changing dynamics in that area anyway, correct? And so, okay, so it is something that we're not just,
It wasn't a priority on this project.
Okay.
It was sort of an anecdotal piece that got talked about, when we were doing tours and things like that. So, yeah, it exists as a set of concerns. It wasn't something that we spent a lot of time diving into.
well, anytime there's, no, it's okay, I'm sorry. Anytime there's ADA needs, that perks my attention, and then anytime there's safety or security concerns, that also perks my attention, so.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Commissioner, and I didn't want to poo-poo, in terms of that, the ADA piece of it. I get it. The county went through and did a very exhaustive review. You'll recall the Meeting the Challenge group that came in several years
Yeah.
ago. So there's been an effort since then to kind of pick things off as we go.
Okay.
And certainly, I think Jeff and Tim each referenced it, that as or if and when we did changes to the Justice Center, those are ideally the time to do those things, right? Because you get economy out of it. If you're going in and hitting it just to do ADA stuff, that's not necessarily the most
Yeah.
economical way to do it. So we've tried real hard. In fact, we've wiped out, I think entire pages of the ADA report, during a single project because we had 20 things on there and we took care of them all. That's a much more effective and cost-effective way to do it. I'm not saying that would be easy on these projects, but it is an opportunity. However, at Police and Courts in Loveland, that was not part of what we focused on. So.
Okay, and I have to tease you on your word choice, because now I think maybe you're hanging around me too much by saying poo-pooing, because that's something that I tend to say a lot, so I hope I'm not rubbing off on you in that way. So thank you. Sorry I had to say that because I said, he's hanging around me too much.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. I didn't.
I was just going to add that we didn't want to smooth over the fact that those things still exist. Those are still issues that are open. If we don't build a whole new facility where we combine everything, those remain to be problems that are a separate project. So to be transparent, they're in the list because this does not solve those problems.
Have other questions, Commissioner?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly too, that the scenario 2 and 3 are like not 3A, but just 2 and 3 are the same cost range?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
they are. Yes.
Great, that's helpful. And from a security aspect and safety for the folks who are coming to the courtrooms and for the staff and for our wonderful judges and their staff, do these all address at the same level of safety and security for all three scenarios? Are the same level of safety and security and function?
Yes.
It's kind of functionality, but they're all kind of the same level of comfort for those?
Yeah, so we would anticipate that any of these scenarios would address the current needs and expand on what safety needs to be today in a facility like this. So all of that would be addressed within this, whether that's, and I know part of what we did in some of these diagrams and test fits, it actually looked at expanding the lobby space to create a more robust ability for security as staff, as public come in, and thinking about that a little differently. How does staff actually come in? There's lots of ways to handle security in that perspective, right? And so all of those things can be addressed in any of these scenarios at whichever level needs to be done.
Great. Go ahead, and then I want to clarify that too.
Yeah, just want to amplify and give you an example. So the current courtrooms don't have an attorney-client visiting room for folks who are coming in who are in custody. And we added that into the program. So any of the expansion space as well as the renovations of the existing courtrooms would look to be able to try to do that so that the attorneys didn't have to go down to the holding facility or over to the jail to see their clients. And that's a feature in terms of security as well as access for the clients and for the attorneys that we see in a lot of newer courthouses, but that was really something that we started adding into courthouses after in 2000.
One piece we talked about too quite a lot, and even recently, was the importance of having flexibility. If indeed, a family service center is a good option and becomes, potentially one that we would, really explore further, is the importance of having flexibility in the space so that it wouldn't tie the hands of judicial to, to be too tied into what that means from a court standpoint. They would need to. The numbers that show it's not a hoodwink. I mean, it meets those needs, but clearly there would be additional space in that building that would require the need to have the same flexibility that the building has or that the current building has today. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of security, in terms of provisions, things like that. The flexibility of it would be important to judicial to make sure that we design that into a standalone building.
So if I might, Madam Chair, yeah, I'm glad you said that. So I'm thinking and I'm looking at the old, I shouldn't say old, the current facility, the current Justice Center, which, I'm very grateful for Chief Blanco, Katicha Blanco, and others who have allowed me to come and sit in the courtroom and learn and kind of walk through and experience. I've walked through a lot of new high schools, new elementary school, new middle school lately, probably more than I ever have in my lifetime, which is great. Unfortunately, my kids didn't get to have some of those new schools, but I'm glad for these new generations. But unfortunately, a lot of the design is for active shooter and school safety, and that's how some of the design or the approach or certain elements are designed for these new facilities for the safety of our children and others, which is really important. And I see I'm thinking as I'm looking at this current building and how it everyone has to kind of walk in for the public, it's kind of designed. And I know that your designs and the stacking doesn't really show the details of maybe how that would be put into the actual design of the building. But for a scenario aspect and where the buildings are and how I see one where they're kind of more separate and there's a big space between them, and if the new center they're all kind of together. I'm sure that you looked at this and talked about that. Is there one that has more security challenges, because I'm kind of building on this conversation we're having, that provides more challenges for security versus maybe one that's more simpler? And because I know that's part of that design thought is
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'll do my best to kind of generalize the answer of it, which I think is accurate in terms of this project, but also previous projects. For instance, when the current Justice Center opened, there were two entrances, right? That was closed up. One of them was closed up. So when you have multiple places like that, I think that's where you're headed with this. It certainly does add complexity to it, and it certainly adds resource need. So that isn't ideal, right? The separation of those two buildings, ideally, you wouldn't do that necessarily. There are some advantages to it. I'm sorry, you wouldn't do that for a security reason, right? You may do it for a whole bunch of other reasons, and that's what we're talking about today. But if you're focused strictly on security, fewer points, those kind of things all make good sense. And so I hope that at least somewhat answers your question. So.
Yeah, it does, and I appreciate that. And also, I know that the design will probably come where it shows how that is, but
So I'd like to, can I tack on to this?
Please.
Or pile on, for lack of a better term? So each of these scenarios do look at that. We would anticipate one point of entry, okay? So if it's the existing building and you're looking, for instance, at 3A, the idea actually there is to actually create a new lobby space that is adequate for security for both of those, and would actually then allow for, and that's why that separation is there. So now you can actually have folks that are here for family service type programs to head that direction, and criminal and what have you may go the other direction. So that was part of the idea. And again, I think as we design the building and think through that building, those things would come out. If we're looking at a scenario that was just a true expansion of the facility, we were anticipating that there is going to need to be an expansion of some kind or an addition at some kind of the public lobby space to create that same security. And then if you look at the one where it's a standalone family services center, we would anticipate the ability for security as you came into the public area, into that lobby space. So you'd have that at that location as well as security then at the courthouse. So we are anticipating those being equal and creating that from a state-of-the-art security component moving forward.
Thank you very much. That actually was a question I wasn't going to ask, but I had a wondering was that little yellow lobby space and the design for that. Thank you for helping my brain not ponder that for the rest of the day. That's wonderful. So one just clarifying question, if I might, Madam Chair. The safety and security of staff and our judges and our DA and of folks and families coming in they've been equally weighted and addressed, but especially for staffing with parking and security, that's all been equally weighed, or maybe making sure staff feel safe and not walking, because I know when I see people walking all the time. I'm out in parking lot. Sometimes I sit in my car. So if any of you were wondering why I sit in my car before I leave, sometimes I just watch people coming back and forth. And employees, I notice I recognize some employees. I see how far they're walking, where they're going to, and who's coming in, who's walking across to the second floor over there. And just wondering about, when it gets cold, when it gets winter, thinking about their stories. And so I think about those things sometimes, which I guess makes me weird. But I'm just always wondering, I'm always worried about security, because I sometimes leave here at 11 o'clock at night, 11:30, and so I'm just curious, those are things I think about. So I just this has all been, I'm sure you have, but I just need to ask the question equally for staff who are leaving at 11:30 at night, as well as people coming in. I mean, I'm sure you have, but I want to hear it, so.
Yeah, I think in general, I think we can say that yes, it would be considered to be the same, emphasis, points of emphasis for safety and security. Again, it wasn't. We haven't gotten to the design elements of these, of any of these, nor I mean, we wouldn't until we got into an actual project. But yeah, the importance of it is, obviously we share that concern. So.
That's included in the program as part of what we did throughout that. So when you get that program, you'll be able to see all of that. I will share this as it relates to, I'm trying to figure, I think it's 3 that has the standalone building. I would tell you that option, although I believe that we've covered the idea of the public entry space and what have you, there does need to be a discussion about how staff comes to this facility or this building. This can be done a couple different ways, and we didn't figure it out, and in the stacking diagram it would work. There may need to be a lower level here for staff parking for those folks that are working in this facility. I also know, as we've talked through with the 8th Judicial District, that there may be judges that go from the existing courts facility to the new facility. And how does that work, right? And there may be a challenge there from that perspective. And that may be one of the drawbacks to this scenario is, are they going to get in their car that's at the lower level of the existing building and drive over to the other one? Or are they going to walk across the street? So that's one of those that probably needs to be evaluated as you think about this as a scenario and an option. Do we have the security? Yes. It may not be ideal at the end of the day, and it may make this option not something that the county would like to pursue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that's all the questions I have at this time. I might have more, but I do appreciate you entertaining all my questions.
And feel free to reach out to Tim or I or Ken, and if you have as you see the report here in the next, hopefully, 3 or 4 weeks, and you have other comments or questions, do let us know, and we'll be more than happy to help. Tim wants to talk again.
Tim has something to say.
So I wanted to address your very first question, Commissioner, about the pricing out security work at the Loveland Police and Courts building. And Jeff and I talked about it. And one of the problems is it's actually easy to sort of estimate what the ADA upgrades would be for the courtrooms. It is almost impossible at this level without a design to price out what fixing the security issues of how the sheriff's deputies bring prisoners into the courthouse, how they move them into, they're only holding there is between the courtrooms. And those challenges are really at the design level, they're not really at the planning level.
Okay.
And we just could, without understanding what it is you needed to do to fix that, we think we have some ideas because he's an architect and I used to be one. We always want to solve those problems, but we can't at this stage price that out. But there would be some investment involved in that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Cafalas, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner. Another question that comes to mind is, what are we doing differently in this modeling and these design scenarios to avoid what happened when we came up with the projections, the modeling and the projections for this building? Because it seems like in all what you shared with us today, whether it's 7 stories or this way, all of the space is occupied once the construction is done. So 20 years from now, what are we doing to avoid what apparently we didn't avoid as well as we could have this time around? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me start the conversation, and then I'm going to have Tim chime in on another element as it relates to the numbers, because I think that part is important to understand what that projection looks like over the next 20 years. And we can't, as we said before, we don't have a crystal ball, but I don't think in 10 years you're going to fill this need. I could be wrong, but somebody at a higher level is probably going to have to tell you that. What I will share as it relates to your current facility, and this may not be a popular answer, but I'm going to answer it honestly. There's actually a way to do what you're asking. That facility was thought about and looked at from the standpoint of expansion of court in a different way than maybe what it is today and what it needs to be today. But there is a way to do it if you so chose. I think, though, the county is doing something that's just great in the fact that they're keeping the DA in that space, and that's real, and that needs to happen. The idea behind expansion for your existing facility was to take the DA and their space and either expand the building to create office space for them or move them to somewhere else and allow for courts to occur on that level. That can still happen today. There may be some pieces and parts that have to move around, but that could happen. That doesn't solve the next 20 years. And I think that's the real crux of this report, is the fact that if you want to solve for the next 20 years, then we've got to look at scenarios that we presented today. The thing about these scenarios and when you get design started is to really evaluate flexibility. There was a question earlier about what's courts doing 10 years from now? What's courts doing 20 years from now? I can tell you right now, although the pandemic and COVID has changed what courts may have been progressing towards, because courts was progressing towards the idea of more mediation, more conversations and solving them prior to actually showing up to court. And it was really, if you look at and Tim can talk a little bit more about this, and the technology element, those things were really moving in a different direction to creating court space, okay? But because of the pandemic and because of what your state has from a standpoint of legislation, from the standpoint of trial and things along those lines and who gets arrested, the funnel is real big up at the top, right? It collects everything. And then there's this small element called your courts. And it's not just here in Fort Collins, it's everywhere. And you're funneling this big group into this small group, right? And until you can grow that, which is what shows here, to grow that, until you do that, this part doesn't start to shrink. And if this part doesn't start to shrink, then having the conversation about what's courts doing 10 years from now or 20 years from now, and can we do something different? How does technology work? Without having those types of things, those are going to be hard discussions to have. But I do think there's going to be, we just finished a courthouse 2 years ago, and I can tell you we incorporated more conference rooms in that space, in that building, for mediation and for conference type hearings and things along those lines to happen. And they are doing it. They're actually moving that needle forward. I'm not saying that's the right model. I'm not saying that's the right model for here. That's something you, as a county and the 8th Judicial District, needs to evaluate and look at, and even the state has to begin to think about. Because part of what we're doing here as a study is based on information that we've got from those individuals. So I got on my soapbox. I probably shouldn't have, and Tim, I'll let you finish.
I don't have much to add to that. When they built the courthouse, it was fully occupied. And since then, I don't know whether this was the original intention. We weren't there to have the discussion with the county commissioners and the architects at the time, but I fully believe, and this is what we see in courthouses all over the country, if you don't use a model where you build floors that aren't used yet, you have an expectation that at some point you're going to need to grow the courts. And so they moved probation out. That was one of the biggest moves that they made. There were some other smaller offices and functions that were also moved out of the building. But for the most part, that was their ability to expand. And also they were very clever about adding magistrate hearing rooms on the first floor in spaces that maybe they didn't displace anybody, they just squeezed in tighter. And that is a pretty common model, but they're doing a lot more now in many of these scenarios. If you build this building in the next 3 to 5 years, there will probably be upper floors that will be courtrooms in the future that you don't have to build out yet. And that's a pretty common model to anticipate that growth.
Did you have further questions? You don't? Okay. So I'm going to ask the $138 million question, which is, right, because that's the low end of some of these build-outs. What are other communities doing? What are creative ways of financing this? Because even, contemplating the lower end of the spectrum is pretty daunting. And so, and knowing that the state's underfunded judicial, whatever that's called, is $3 million and only applies to communities that are smaller and have a lower tax base. And I'm not sure that would ever be increased to be able to accommodate a community like ours. So I know that we're not primarily here to discuss that, but have we seen any models that are working? Because we had a tax that failed. Did some polling on that, and it looked like it wouldn't fail. And it did. And so, what kind of, what are we seeing, and what do we think in this space?
Great question. Thank you. I think it's not uncommon across Colorado. The same issue. There's a good number of counties that I've been in touch with that our folks have. John Gossett with the State Court Administrator's Office and Elizabeth may have some things they'd like to share about this, specific to active projects that are being pursued. But I know at least a couple of folks that I think we're planning to watch, must be listening today, curious to see what, where this is going to land, at least in term, again, not expecting firm direction and all that, but at least a general idea of, of how big of a deal this is, to Larimer County. How do we begin to tackle it? Those kind of questions. We talked recently about, a public-private partnership, kind of a model. That's a tough model. You've seen evidence, I think, of that, with the ranch and what was considered for that. We're not proposing that by any means. I think, some kind of a mixed equation, maybe, and specific to Larimer County again. Carol Block has done some things with some of the figures that she's seen the presentation, just in advance of it, and might have some things to share as well. But I'm not trying to dance around the question, but it is a very common issue, and in some cases, years and years of that same, kind of struggle to get to a point where, the community embraces it to the point of where they support that and make it happen. So I don't
Sure, I
think
guess
it's
so
a very
that's
good
one
answer.
way is to try to express to the community that there is this need and to be able to have a sales tax that covered that. Maybe I don't understand how the public partnership would work in a space like this.
Well,
Has that been?
It's more of a development option, right? To get somebody to come in with front-loaded capital that allows for it, and then you sort of pay them back.
Lease
to,
out the
yeah,
building in a
exactly.
way kind of situation.
But I
Okay.
think what I recall, with the ranch, it suggested it for the ranch. I think it was 2 to 1, right? You spend about double, over time
Sure.
to get that, and so it isn't first on the list of where you'd go.
Okay.
And so I wished I had a great
No,
answer
I
to
mean,
the question.
there probably isn't a great answer, right? I mean, there's no easy answer. Let's just say that there is an answer. It involves, some massaging to figure out what that is. Commissioner Kavalis, did you have a question?
Well, just a comment, or maybe it is a question, actually. I'm wondering, were you intending, do we want to allow some time for the chief judge or any of those folks to speak? Or at some point, I think we want to engage them or listen to their information either today or at another time. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Maybe, yeah, I mean, I do think that there are a lot of people in the room that would probably like to talk.
Well, I mean, I
All
think,
right, and I agree that the judge is affected by it, and I do agree. I mean, it's interesting to be in this space where we're kind of talking about this. It's fairly theoretical. This is not, like you said, you're planning, you're not designing. So, but sure, if you'd like the judge to come up, I want to ask Commissioner Shattuck McNally if she has any questions before we do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also have been pondering your question as well. But I've been not pondering the 138 million. I've been pondering 168 million because knowing construction costs in a year from now could be right. So I've been actually pondering that, and we have a lot of projects they're important, worthy, but this is really a big need. With the potential for money that's coming through for federally, I wonder, I'm just pushing this out there, kind of throwing, I don't know if it's throwing spaghetti, but there are some grants and some needs coming forward, right? And if we look at this as a need and maybe use also it as a way to save, we're saving space or energy or something, just ways to look at some of that federal money that we could tap in to use for at least starting that would be sooner. Is that, do you think of any elements that would help us kind of qualify or maybe look at that with this latest round and some of these other things are coming through with the Jobs Act and stuff? We haven't thought about other pots of money that we could try to go for. I don't know if this would qualify, but just curious, especially with the Family Services Center. I think that I was just kind of pondering that might be attractive thing to put on a grant application. I'm just curious.
Yeah, another good question. I think the specifics of that options, or that option specifically, I think has some merit probably, and in particular even to the likelihood that the citizens might begin to embrace that idea. I think that was it was certainly a part of the conversations we've had for months on this in terms of the upside of that. I don't know if Josh has comments, in terms of the ARPA money or things like that. I'm not sure if you were starting to get that, sort of thinking about that, or starting to consider what that could look like.
Sort of that. But let me pause that real quick and let me ask one clarifying question. We do have a juvenile court, and I think I bet we had the specialty courts presentation the other day, and I think there was a specialty drug court for juveniles, and then it had the family court. So with the juvenile court and the family court, that would be kind of in this center, and would that be over there? Would they still kind of be where they're at? I'm just kind of when you say family services, I'm trying to understand where some of these specialty courts are going to be, because they, as I understood it, maybe I understood wrong. We've gotten a lot of information lately. The same staff or similar staff are staffing all of those courts. And sometimes I was watching the other day, which I'm still very grateful and moved by my experience. They're moving and talking to families in the audience or the gallery. I'm not sure what the courtroom, and also talking with the clients and the DA's office, and they're just moving around. And so to me, if I know there's separate days that they are in court, but also it seemed to me that's the same group of people that need to be kind of a hub, that it's close and not moving. So I'm just, I mean, I'm kind of probably dying into the weeds, but that was probably taken in consideration with some of this breakout between the two
Yeah,
buildings.
I think maybe a short answer is that those are all, they could be on the table. I mean, nothing has been ruled out, and so I think that those kind of considerations, if there was some advantage to rolling that in or having that be a component, I think that's certainly an option. So I mean, again, we haven't gotten into that far of a project to say yes and no to those kind of equations. So.
And so then if I could pause in case, unless you have something to add, I would like to go back to the pause and then have Josh see if there's any things you think, but I see you're tempted to speak on that. That's your choice, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. And then we can bring the judge up, I guess, and others who might want to speak.
I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, I didn't know I keep having him look at me like he wanted to answer my.
I'm going to pass.
Okay, thanks.
Good afternoon, Josh Fudge, County Budget Director. I'm not aware of any programs within the bipartisan infrastructure bill or any of the other recent federal legislation that this would be a good candidate for as a whole. Within the energy pieces, maybe if there's some components to a structure, maybe that would qualify, but I don't think that this type of facility is a real good match for a lot of those programs. I know the state does or did at least have a grant program for courthouses, but those are really meant for smaller counties that we wouldn't really qualify for. So,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is sort of, we're on our own steam. I mean, I will say that I think that the fact that we have some of the problem-solving courts or specialty courts can be a case to help the public understand that we're looking at different judicial models, because I do think that there's sometimes a hesitancy to be, for people who are maybe unhappy with the judicial system, that they see that we're working on justice reform, I think is valuable in those discussions. And, there are a lot of people in our community that aren't involved in the judicial system. And so that, I think, becomes where the case is really hard to make for public funding. And so you really have to have a good case. I guess, Chief Judge Blanco, if you're willing to come up and say a few words about maybe some reflections that you have after seeing the report. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Well, what to say? I think we do a really good job, and we want to do a good job serving the community. And the truth is, when you ask some of these questions, and you ask really good questions, this is a problem that started a long time ago, and unfortunately on both sides of this table we shoulder what hadn't been done in the past. It was built, and then it was Band-Aid solutions for 23 construction, essentially, projects that I think carried the predecessors on both sides of this table to a problem that is huge today. We have no more space, and our population is booming, and the things we do in that building are not just criminal justice. We help families. We are hearing people that cannot resolve their disputes alternatively. and they deserve to have their cases heard timely. And the more we are limited by space and we don't have any solutions in the forefront, the longer it's going to take for people to have access to justice. And that's a real problem in the community. And, you know, I know that that's not lost on anyone at the table, but it is particularly hard when that is what you do all the time. And we sit here and none of these other Band-Aids are good ones. I don't want to ask you to move our DA out of the building because I firmly believe the DA deserves the support of having Sheriff Smith's deputies and the security in our building to protect them. I wish my probation department had that security because we know that there are increased number of weapons coming into probation. That's a huge safety concern. We have no holding facility in Loveland, so if your case is in Loveland, your case takes longer to have access to justice. You might sit in jail longer, even though it sounds really nice that we have a facility over there. We have ADA issues in both of the buildings, whether you're coming in to serve as a juror or whether you have your case being heard in front of the court. These are all problems that the can got kicked down the road so far that now it becomes a huge problem today, and it affects safety, security, access to justice, and so many different facets. And so I think you all get it, but our problem is that I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow if we have a new judicial officer coming. And we can't deny having it because we can only, as the architects explained, the funnel is as strong as its smallest point. And we don't have any more justice solutions, so we can't process anything faster or differently. We are probably, I don't want to be rude, but I think we were told we were very efficient in how we're utilizing our space, how we structure our docket. So I guess I'd just say we want to be good community partners. We want to be good stewards as well for our community. We have met our limit and there's no more Band-Aid left here. So there's no more fat to cut. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to sit with any of you, show you what we're doing in our building anytime, but I don't think there's anything else that we can do.
Commissioner Kafalis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chief Judge Blanco. I think we can agree there's a serious problem that needs to be addressed. The question still remains, what is the best scenario and how are we going to pay for it? So I think that a really important, and I think we all agree, I think a really important next step is to put our heads together and look at different scenarios as far as financing, maybe consideration of going to the voters, other things. I might put myself out on a limb here with our state judicial administrator folks, but they've had it pretty easy sitting over there. I guess I'm wondering, is there any room for a conversation of, would the legislature or the state ever consider a different funding model? With all the needs that are occurring in the state, and where there seems to be robust amounts of revenue that some of it's being turned back, and I'm sure a lot of people need that and appreciate that. Why can't we have that conversation with the state to help the state kick in? It's got to be a cost-sharing model, in my opinion. So I guess I'd like to put our friends from the state on a friendly and respectful notice that it seems like that should be part of the conversation about how we're going to pay for this. Silence.
Sure, yes. Yeah, I'm sure those are conversations that we can have. I don't know how those will go. You know more about things at the state level than at least I do. So
Thank you.
Commissioner, please.
So, this is, I remember being a few years ago, it's probably closer than that, but it seems like years ago, where there was another study and conversation. Then I was in the room or watching, I think, and it was interesting, robust conversation. And this one certainly, to me, feels a little more hopeful, I guess, or a little more, at least some ideas that are intriguing to me. So I'm thinking this is great, we're having a conversation, but obviously, I agree with Chief Judge Blanco that we're out of space, there's no more Band-Aids, MacGyver has been maxed out, no more MacGyvering, the Justice Center, and we saw how that happens. We did that in Thompson School District for 20 years, and then it finally crashed with the server wall, and that impacted my kids and others and every teacher and student in the district. So I know what happens when it finally crashes. And I know there's been a lot of talks, and yeah, we can go back and predecessors and all the issues going forward. There's a lot of lessons learned, but I guess I'm looking today, we've having conversations. We obviously need to take some kind of step forward to figure out what we're going to do. We can't just kind of hoping that, I'll find $150 million in my couch cushions, because that's not going to happen. Trust me. I find dog bones, but I don't find that much kind of money. So I'm curious, what do you all think are next steps? Like, do we have to figure out a funding model first, or are we looking at which scenario seems more attractive, or is this all contingent on land purchases or funding? Or, I mean, we have some options here that have a lot of variables that are contingent on other partners or other pieces coming together. And so I'm just curious, today, I mean, this is great, and I appreciate everyone being here, but I'm tend to be the one, I always have big ideas and I love time out ideas, but then I'm also like, okay, what are we going to do?
Right.
So that's kind of my question, Madam Chair.
I
Yeah.
think that's the question to us, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, like, honestly, it's in our, ballpark, and not wanting to kick the can. I mean, the idea, I do think we need to figure out what funding looks like, and the appetite for a sales tax, because I don't see any other funding mechanism that would come up with $138 million. I mean, I can see things that will help that along. We have ARPA dollars. We maybe, there's $1 million here that we might be able to transfer, but I mean, we cannot come up with $138 million in our budget as it exists. So there would have to be a dedicated funding stream, I would think. I can't see any other option.
I think Carol Block has put together some real just preliminary information about what it could look like as a component of it, to have COPs be potentially a piece of this as well. Certainly not as a primary or as the primary, but that could be, an option, to have as a piece of this thing. Nobody has the answer, unfortunately, and so I think it will require sitting down. It's a chicken and the egg, right? Do you figure out what you can afford and then go try to funnel that together? I think you can kind of work together with judicial and determine, based on the foundation that's been provided today, of what could work, and I think that was what, that's where we landed as a project team, I think, through this last, 8 months or so, to try to figure that out, knowing that, what could work at 150, let's call it, right? Wow, that's not a great, thing to go kick across, the table and go, what are we going to do, right? So I hope it doesn't feel that way today. I just hope that that it at least is a fundamental next step, and I think that, from here going forward, we begin to exhaust that and look at what that looks like in terms of getting it in front of the voters. And I think we've all sort of, probably had conventional wisdom that would ultimately probably have to happen. And then what does that look like from a shared, effort, between judicial and the state's role in that, obviously, and our primary role in it. It won't be easy. And, it didn't happen as a piece of a transportation, option for the voters. And so, having this be potentially a standalone project to get in front of folks and have them begin to embrace that, I think is a very steep uphill push.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it can't happen. We haven't tried that.
Sure.
And so I think that I'm not giving you any answers, but it seems like this at least provides a framework for beginning to have those conversations and
No, I agree, and it was not, there was not intent to sort of, punish the messenger in any kind of way. I mean, I think we all kind of knew that this was the scenario going forward. It is tough, and I do, having the transportation and the capital projects combined, of the two, the transportation was the more popular. There again, more people drive in a car on the road, so I think that it would be a heavy lift, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Right.
So, Commissioner Cafalas, did you have something? And then we were maybe going to ask the district attorney and the sheriff to come up for. No, I do have a hard stop at 3:30, so
Yeah.
hope we can finish by then.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think just to reinforce, I think something that I heard Commissioner Shattuck McNally, I mean, part of the next step, including looking at different funding scenarios, I think we also need to have additional conversations with the potential partners, and that will help inform, if it's a new building, where, in relation to Old Town, if it's an expansion, is there potential for cooperation with regard to purchasing land or perhaps swapping land and those kinds of things? And I know we've had some of those conversations.
Yeah,
So
some of
that's gotta be
ongoing.
part of it.
Yeah,
That's
thank
all.
you.
Commissioners?
Oh,
Yes.
I'm sorry, just one
Yeah,
moment.
please.
So I think you're asking all the right questions. Today was intended to be sort of a distillation of what we know and what we think is possible and potentially feasible. So, building a new building may be the most expensive option. It may solve the problems fastest, but that may not be feasible given the price tag. Some of the other options where we would have to acquire land might be more feasible. I think what Ken and team are looking for is, should we go forward and try to acquire land? Is that something that you have an appetite for? Should we begin in earnest these conversations with the city of Fort Collins and others who might own land that we're interested in working with or swapping with, or whatever the process may look like? As we continue to work with the partners who have to live in the building, operate in the building, we know that we can't do this in a vacuum. They're part of the conversation. They have been from the beginning, and they need to continue to be. There's probably no perfect solution. So I think, Ken, next steps for you would be to get this to a place where you know how to progress so that we can come back with another decision point for you with more involvement from everyone, all the partners who have to work in the building.
Yeah, that sounds, so I'll ask the commissioners that question. Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
I have been talking about this for a while. As you know, you probably know where I'm going to say. Yes, please. I think we should move forward and have those conversations. I think we are in a spot now that we haven't been in before, where this is more of a possibility. And I have been hoping and trying to do my part to facilitate those conversations. So I would say yes. I think that's a big piece of the and variable of this scenario, and I think it's a wise and prudent move because it is space-wise and being close and location. It's just makes sense to me. So I would be yes, please move. I would like to see us move forward with those conversations and see what we can do, because that would really change the scenarios big time if we didn't have that. So that's my answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Cafalas.
yes.
I would, sure. I do want to remind everyone that there are, when we're talking about taxes, there's a level at which there will be that we get beyond which there will be no appetite for them at all. That we have transportation, childcare, and housing, potential people talking about those kind of taxes as well. There's transit in Fort Collins. There's other things that are sort of looming. They all are needs in our community. They all affect families in our community. They're all, things that people feel that we need. So I think that in the conversation about taxation, that we have to be really realistic about what asks there are upcoming, and we can't have a 12% tax in our city or cities because we need to fund these things. So we need to really have a good look, I think, before, I do want to proceed and look at what possibilities there might be for that land. I do want to look at that. And I really want to sort of examine what we see on the horizon in the next couple of years, because we ourselves are going around to communities and saying transportation is underfunded. We can't build out our transportation system. And so, where do we hit this sort of max point that we can't ask for more dollars from our community? And what does that look like? And thinking about all the needs we have, I just think we should have a very comprehensive conversation about taxation, and think this through before we propose anything, knowing that those other taxes are potentially out there. So that's just wanted to. I just get nervous when we talk about this, right? Because there are other needs in the community, and they're all important. They're all about taking care of our families and doing right by our community. They're and it's hard to say this one takes precedence over that one.
Yeah, one thing we haven't spent a lot of time during this process is to focus on phasing, because we wanted to show it as a, more of a comprehensive look, and otherwise you'd have, 200 slides, right, to show kind of what it would look like as you bit off pieces of the apple. But I think that if there's an ongoing effort, two ongoing efforts, one to continue the conversations with Judicial, between the county and Judicial in terms of where this could lead, but also what could be afforded and what options there are to that. That seems to fit into and kind of funnel into what could be options. Now, it's not ideal. You often spend more, on a 20-year window or, to get there, but it isn't necessarily, $250 million on the front end either. And so I think that'd be that has to be part of what we would start to talk about as well, with Josh and Carol and others. So
Yeah, thank you for suggesting that too, because that is an option. Commissioner Cavalos asked too if the sheriff, you'd like to come up, say a few words, and then maybe the district attorney would like to come up and just add to this conversation. We have a few minutes for that. You're welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner Stevens and the rest of the board. I was actually around in 96, 97 when this project came through, and I can tell you with the breadth of what's going on in the county and the growth, it feels a lot like that 96, 97 period. I think Carol may be the only person that remembers that was involved in those as well. There were a lot of these big projects, and one of the things that I would offer up as a perspective from being involved then is we've got a tradition under Tabor bringing these initiatives to the community. It often takes more than once to get something that's passed, and you're aware of that as well, that a lot of times that's our ability and willingness to listen to the feedback when we run an initiative that doesn't make it through. What was it that was a concern? What things have changed? So while I understand the earlier version didn't make it through, I don't think that forecasts where we're going now. Another reminder is obviously we're 100,000 residents additional since we did this facility. I remember a lot of discussions on the design. Things got pared back at the time on some of the original requests, but it's always hard to build space that's not going to be occupied. I think it's just a matter of making sure, as we work together with the board on the jail expansion, to make sure that that's set so you can add those things, easily when that time comes along. But with that perspective, I think it is smart to look forward. We certainly at the Sheriff's Office have concerns if you talk about separate structures, because as you know, the responsibility of the sheriff is to secure all of those courts. That's going to mean duplication or triplication of some of those services, which becomes a long-term operating, which in a certain way is kicking a can down the road. We prefer consolidated, where you can have one area for that, for those services to come through. The other part I would just add in is there certainly are some security issues that would be appropriate for an executive session, understandably, and not a public session to maybe educate the board if it came down to that, where we're at. And I'll just remind you, 97 is when this was passed, planned in 98, and that's all pre-Columbine. And the world has changed in how we do security in a number of facilities. I think we've made some smart upgrades, but there's things we definitely learned out of it. So while it is a big chunk, I do believe that there are some good options that can get us there, and I think good education with the public of those. That, you know, one of the core responsibilities of counties from 1861 was to provide court securities for the state courts. It's always been one of our responsibilities, and so I think that's one that we definitely keep in mind. With that, I'll turn it over to the DA.
I'll steal yours here. Thanks, and I know there's a hard stop, so I'll try to be pretty brief here. First, I appreciate for the three folks presenting today. I think this was a really thoughtful process, and we had some long and detailed discussions about what our needs were at the DA's office, and so I think those have been incorporated, and I appreciate that. Our top need is to stay in the building, frankly, and the other options I would defer to the commission and the costs and all of that. And it's not just a convenience aspect, it's an efficiency aspect that we would be losing an enormous amount of employee time if we were shuttling back and forth. And our attorneys are running up and down the stairs, well, the elevators actually, all day, but also investigators, advocates, legal assistants. So whole teams would be shuffling back and forth, and we'd really lose a lot of time. But maybe more importantly is the public service that us being in the building affords. And so often, for instance, a victim advocate might be shuttling up and down because there are victims constantly in the courtrooms that they're needing to attend to. And so if they weren't located in the building, those services drop off. And, when we have victims coming, often they're meeting with us before a criminal case, after the criminal case. Often there are those civil cases that are sort of circulating simultaneously in conjunction with a criminal case that they might already be at the building for. And so to be located somewhere off-site, especially further away, would be an incredible burden for victims, for witnesses, for pro se defendants, whom we see very many of, especially in our misdemeanor and county courts, to try to go to two different locations. And we have pro se defendants, they'll have a court hearing, they come to our office to get discovery, they talk to an attorney about a possible resolution, they're talking to investigators. We have, victims are not just talking to attorneys, they're talking to victim advocates about services, a restitution coordinator about getting restitution for property lost, crime victims comp, it goes on and on. So that would be our top priority. I've also expressed before, I think the Loveland facility is incredibly beneficial towards the southern end of our community. As has been stated both by Commissioner Shattuck McNally with the ADA issues and Judge Blanco touched on some of the issues, not a perfect facility down there, would obviously need some attention. But I do think, given the huge breadth of this county, as the Commission is well aware, having those services, again, down there for the public, especially victims, is really important. Folks spend a ton of time coming to our office, getting transport to our office, and so to make that more difficult, we'd lose cases, frankly, in addition just to the lessening of services. Law enforcement agencies might have a case and a victim for a couple weeks. We might have that for 12, 18 months, and so we need to maintain those relationships. And then in the finance piece, I understand the difficult situation the Commission is in and the $138 million plus question, and we're cognizant of that. Obviously, I cannot solve that issue, but I would offer at least this, which is there were sort of questions about communicating more effectively what those courts do. Things like the specialty courts, which we mentioned, that has been a priority of ours over the last year and a half, is actually being transparent with the community about what's going on, communicating with the community, engaging them on all the things we do offer, from victim services all the way to specialty courts that aren't your sort of traditional assumptions about what happens in a courthouse. And so we've tried to communicate those things over social media, community meetings, being out in the community. In addition to the sort of traditional successes like convictions at trial, some of those other successes as well. There was just a Reporter Herald article about our adult diversion expansion just last week. So some of those things are done, and we're more than willing to be a part of trying to continue to engage the community. I know that Judge Blanco wants to do her part. Of course, they're much more restrained than we are about being able to be out there and talk to people and so forth. And so we're trying to do that as effectively as we can. And whatever the solution that the Commission chooses we'll need some of that community engagement aspect, and we're certainly willing to participate that in any extent possible. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we?
I just want to make sure we thank the consultants and
Oh,
our
yes.
facilities director, but I'm sure you'll do a stellar job.
I would like to thank the cooperative process. I mean, I think you couldn't find better partners to work with than the folks we're working with. Everyone is representing their point of view in a professional and thoughtful way. This could be a very different kind of process in another kind of county, and so thank you all for what you do to help us manage this process and kind of get to a proposal. I hope you didn't hear anything today that you feel like we're on the wrong track, like stop us now. Otherwise, we're going to keep moving and keep coming back to you as we narrow down what this could look like and what the funding might look like.
No, that sounds great. I appreciate that. And yeah, thank you, Jeff and Tim. Appreciate your work on this. And yeah, certainly a lot to think about, a lot to contemplate as we move forward. But we need to move forward. That's clearly the message here. And as our sheriff told, it is something that we need to do. It's required that we provide these facilities. So we need to figure out how to do that, and we will. We can do hard things, as they say. And so with that, thank you all for being here. Thanks for everyone who participated today, and certainly we'll probably be calling on you in the future to help us figure this out. So it's 3:25 and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, my shirt. Probably me.